The woman, who used to be my mother-in-law, stood in the middle of her living room and held up a little white stick. The afternoon light came through the lace curtains in soft, slanted lines. White hydrangeas leaned out of a blue and white vase. A painted landscape hung above the mantel, and in the corner, quiet as a held breath, sat an old rocking chair. I had known this woman for years. I had never heard her sound the way she sounded just then. "Sam," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made the whole room go still. "I'm having a baby." The clock on the mantel kept ticking. I didn't. "My name is Sam Dawson. I'm 32 years old, and I fix broken things for a living. I run a small furniture shop on the back end of a quiet street in Charleston, South Carolina, in a low brick building with a tin roof that sings when it rains. People bring me the things they can't bear to throw away. A dresser that came over on a boat. A table 3 generations ate their suppers at. A chair with 100 years of somebody's history soaked into the grain. I sand them down, coax the old joints apart, and put them back together so they'll last another lifetime. It's honest work, and quiet was all I wanted for a long time. I wasn't always alone back there. Once, I was married. Her name was Lauren, and when I met her she was bright and quick and easy to laugh, and I thought that meant we were the same kind of people. We weren't. But I didn't know that yet, and for a while it didn't matter. What I remember most about those years isn't Lauren. It's her mother. Ellen was the only person in that family who ever looked at me like I was worth something on my own. The rest of them measured a man by what he drove and where he summered, and whose name he could drop at dinner. Ellen never asked me those things. She asked what I was working on, and she remembered the answers. When I talked about a chair I was saving, she'd lean in like it was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. And I think, in that house, it might have been, because her house was a cold one. Her husband, Walter, was the kind of man who filled a room by making everyone else smaller in it. He had opinions about everything she did, and he shared all of them. He never raised a hand. He didn't need to. He'd built a whole marriage out of a low, steady disapproval, and she lived inside it the way you live inside weather. So I did what I could. When the light over her sink went out, I changed it, and she stood there holding the ladder and talking to me about nothing. And I remember thinking she seemed lonely in a house full of her own life. Then Walter died. It was sudden, his heart, on an ordinary Tuesday, and in the strange, spinning days after, it was me who made the calls, me who dealt with the funeral home and the flowers and the cousins with opinions. Lauren fell apart in the way that needs an audience. Ellen just went very still and very quiet, and let me carry what I could carry. I didn't think anything of it. That's what family does. I still thought I was family then. We never had children, Lauren and I. It was one more thing we couldn't seem to agree on, and maybe that made it easier for her to leave. She met a man named Trent, with money and big plans and a life that photographed well, and one spring she decided that life looked better than the one we had. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just done, the way you're done with a coat that's gone out of style. The divorce went through by the end of that year, and when a marriage ends, the whole family goes with it. That's the part nobody warns you about. I didn't just lose a wife. I lost the Sunday dinners and the woman who held my ladder and asked me what I was building. The door of that house closed, and I understood I wasn't meant to knock on it again. There was only one thing left of them in my life. In the corner of my shop, under a canvas tarp, sat a rocking chair. It had belonged to Ellen's mother, an old hand-carved spindleback thing, with a crack in one rocker and an arm long given out. Ellen had brought it to me the winter before everything came apart, back when I was still her son-in-law. She'd asked me to save it. I'd started. And then the marriage went down, and nobody came for the chair, and I couldn't quite make myself finish it, and I couldn't quite make myself throw it out. So it just sat there, covered, waiting. The last piece of a family that wasn't mine anymore. I fix broken things for a living. It took me a long time to notice I'd never once tried to fix myself. The knock came on a Thursday in the fall, a little more than 1 year after the papers were signed. I almost didn't answer it. I'd learned to like the version of my life where nobody came around, where the only sounds were the plane and the sandpaper and the rain on the tin. There was a safety in it. A man can't be thrown out of a family twice if he stops belonging to anything at all. But the knock came again, patient, unhurried, the knock of someone who had already decided to wait, and I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door, and there she was, Ellen. Standing in the doorway of my shop with the afternoon behind her, looking older than I remembered and somehow more herself, the way people do when the noise around them finally quiets down. I hadn't seen her in over a year. I hadn't let myself wonder how she was. "Hello, Sam," she said. I said hello back, and then I just stood there like a man who'd forgotten how doors worked. "I've come for my mother's chair," she said. "You never finished it." And that was true. It was completely true. It was also, I understand now, not the reason she was standing on my step. But I didn't understand it then. You've probably already worked out what I hadn't. That's the thing about telling a story after you know how it ends. You can see the whole shape of it, every sign you walked straight past at the time, lit up like you should have known. I didn't know. I just thought a woman had come for a chair. I let her in. I pulled the tarp off it, and she went very quiet, running one hand along the carved back the way you'd touch something that used to belong to a person you missed. "It's further along than I thought," she said. I stopped, I said. It didn't feel right to keep going. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant, and maybe she did. Then she asked if she could watch me work. That was how it started. Not with anything you could point to. She came back the next week to see how it was coming. Then the week after that, she'd sit on the stool by the bench with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands and ask me quiet questions about the wood, about the joints, about why I did it one way and not another, and I'd answer, and the afternoons would somehow be gone. I began, without ever quite admitting it to myself, to listen for her car on the gravel. I began to leave the good stool where she liked to sit instead of piling it with clamps. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story is a lie. The easy version says I was lonely and she was there, and two lonely people will reach for the nearest warm thing. But it wasn't loneliness. Loneliness is a hollow thing, and this was full. It was the way she remembered that I took my coffee black and would leave a cup on the bench for me without being asked. It was the way she'd stay a full hour after the reasonable time to leave, and then another, until the light went gold and then gray in the shop windows, and neither of us moved to turn on the lamp. It was the way she went, still, and looked at her hands whenever Lauren's name came up, and how I found myself saying that name less and less, just to keep that stillness off her face. There were smaller things, too, that I only understood later. The way she started parking around the side of the shop instead of out front, where the whole street could see. The way she'd bring 2 cups sometimes, one for each of us, as if she'd already decided she was staying. The way she asked me once, very lightly, whether I ever thought about leaving Charleston, and how carefully she listened while I said no. I answered every one of those questions, like a man reading the label on a jar, never once turning it over to see what was written underneath. I told myself it was kindness, that she was a widow whose family had scattered, that I was a man whose family had done the same, that 2 people at loose ends had found an easy hour in each other's company. I told myself a lot of things. Kindness doesn't make a grown man forget what he was about to say. Kindness doesn't make you rehearse how you'll fill a Thursday 3 days before it comes. But that's what I told myself, over and over, because the truth was standing too close to a door I'd been taught I had no right to open. She never said it, not for a long time. She was too honest to say a thing she thought might cost me something, and too careful to say a thing she thought might not be returned. So she just kept coming, and I kept letting her, and the chair got closer to done a little slower than it needed to, because I think we both understood that when the chair was finished, there'd be no more reason to knock. There was one afternoon I remember the way you remember the exact minute something turned, even when nothing visibly happened. I was fitting the new arm, the one I'd carved to match the old one, and she reached over to steady it while I set the glue, and her hand came down over mine in the wood. Just for a second, warm and sure, and there. Then we both pulled back too fast, and neither of us looked at the other, and I made some noise about clamps that I don't remember, and she said something about the light that she probably doesn't either. But the shop felt different after that. Charged. Like the air before weather, when the birds go quiet and you can smell the rain that hasn't fallen yet. I lay awake that night, doing the arithmetic a decent man does. She was Ellen. She had been my wife's mother. There were words for what I was starting to feel that I did not want said about me. Not in this town. Not by anyone. I told myself it was impossible, and I told myself it was wrong, and then, somewhere near morning, I made myself say the only thing that was actually true, that the marriage was over, had been over for more than a year, that Lauren had chosen a different life and closed that door herself, with both hands, and that whatever I felt had not so much as flickered while there'd been a marriage to betray. It had come clean. It had come after. Every person who could have been hurt by it was already free and gone. That didn't make it simple, but it made it honest. And I've always been able to live with honest, even when honest is heavy. Still, I didn't say anything either. I was a coward in the specific way careful people are cowards. I let the not saying stretch on because the not saying was safe. She'd come, and I'd work, and we'd talk, and I'd walk her to her car in the dark and stand there a beat too long, listening to the engine turn over, and then I'd go back inside and pick the plane up again and tell myself tomorrow was soon enough to figure out what any of it meant. The chair, meanwhile, was nearly finished. I could have finished it in an afternoon. I found reasons not to. A joint that needed one more day to cure. A finish that wanted a second coat. A rocker that could stand a little more sanding, though it was already smooth as riverstone. She never rushed me. I understand now that she didn't want it finished any more than I did. She said she came for the chair. She kept coming back long after a chair could explain it. And I, who make my whole living seeing what a broken thing really needs, somehow could not see the plain truth sitting on the stool across from me, drinking cold coffee, waiting with more patience than I deserved for a man to catch up to something she'd known for years. Lauren came back in the summer. I heard it before I saw it. Word travels in a place like this, and the word was that the big life hadn't held. Trent, it turned out, had big plans the way some men have big appetites. Loud and expensive and gone the moment the check came due. The money that had looked so much better than what we'd had went the way money goes when it was never really there. And Lauren, who had left with the whole world in front of her, came home with nothing but the wreckage and a talent for deciding it was somebody else's fault. She could have landed anywhere. She landed on us. I don't know exactly how she found out. Somebody saw Ellen's car outside my shop one too many times, maybe. Or somebody said something at the store the way people do. Leaning in, lowering their voice, enjoying it. But one afternoon, Lauren's car pulled into my gravel lot, and she came through my door without knocking, and I knew from her face that she already had the whole thing built in her head, walls and roof and all. "So it's true," she said. She looked around my shop like it disgusted her. Then she looked at me. "You couldn't even wait, could you? You went and got your hands on my mother." I set down what I was holding. "It's not what you're making it, isn't it?" Her voice climbed the way it always did when she'd decided the story before the facts. "My father's barely cold, and you're out here playing house with his widow? You seduced my grieving mother, Sam. That's what this is. That's the only thing this could be." Every word of it was chosen to land, and I'll admit that some of them did, because there's a particular kind of ugliness in hearing something clean described in filthy terms by a person determined to make it filthy. I felt my jaw tighten. I felt my hands go still at my sides. I looked out the window at the light on the gravel, and I made myself stay quiet. because I'd learned a long time ago that you cannot win an argument with someone who needs you to be the villain. The more you defend yourself, the more you sound like a man with something to defend. It didn't stop with me. It never does. She went to Ellen next, and she brought a sharper knife. She told her she was making a fool of herself, a woman her age, with a man like me. And when none of that moved Ellen, when her mother only went quiet and steady and refused to be ashamed of something that wasn't shameful, Lauren found the thing she thought would work where the rest had failed. "He's after your money, Mom," she said. "That's all this is, Daddy's money. You're going to hand it all to some handyman who couldn't hold on to a wife, and I'm supposed to just watch?" That was the real weapon. And she knew it, because Lauren was Walter's daughter, and Walter had left an estate, and the law gives a child room to make noise about how a widowed parent spends what's left of it. She started saying the word lawyer. She started saying the phrase undue influence, which is the kind of phrase you don't pick up by accident. Somebody had told her that, somebody who bills by the hour. She let it be known, quietly and then not so quietly, that she'd fight it, that she'd drag her own mother through a courtroom and me along with her, and that she'd make sure everyone in Charleston knew exactly the shape she'd carved us into before she was done. For a few days, it worked the way ugliness works. People I'd known for years suddenly had somewhere else to look when I passed on the sidewalk. The story was easier to repeat than the truth, and it traveled faster, and it flattered the person repeating it, and I understood that if I did nothing it would simply become the thing that had happened, whether it had happened or not. What steadied me wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier and worse. What steadied me was that I had done nothing I needed to hide, and a man with nothing to hide can afford to be patient. I didn't call anyone. I didn't defend myself on any porch or in any checkout line. I just kept the shop open and the lights on and let the people who wanted to look at me come and look. And I trusted, maybe for the first time in my life, that a thing this clean would hold its shape under any amount of noise. Because here is what Lauren didn't count on. She'd built her whole story out of a lie about time, and time keeps records. There was a full year, more than a year, after the divorce when Ellen and I had no contact at all. None. I hadn't set foot near that family. She hadn't called. Anyone who'd wondered where I was in those long months could account for every one of them, because I'd spent them alone in this shop with the plane and the sandpaper and the rain. Whatever Lauren wanted to imagine had begun while she was still married to me had begun, in fact, a long time after she herself had walked out the door and slammed it, and the chair proved it. I keep a book. Every piece that comes through here gets a ticket, dated, in my own hand, the day it lands on my bench. Ellen's mother's chair had a ticket from the winter before the divorce, and not one entry after it until the fall she knocked on my door again. More than a year past the end of everything. The dates were right there in ink, in my own careful handwriting, from back when I had no reason on earth to lie. They didn't care whose feelings were hurt. They just said what was true. There was Faye, too. Faye had been a friend of both families for 30 years, the kind of woman who misses nothing and forgives most of it, and she'd watched the whole long stretch of it from the outside. She knew when the marriage ended. She knew about the empty year. She knew I'd never once taken $1 from Ellen, that this shop fed me, small as it was, on its own, and always had. She'd known Walter, too, and had no illusions about the house Ellen had lived in for 30 years, and she was not about to stand by and watch that same coldness reach out from the grave through the daughter. When it counted, she said so, plainly, to anyone who'd carried Lauren's version to her door, and Faye's word carried further in that town than Lauren's ever would. Lauren had a story ready. The only problem with her story was the calendar. She came back to the shop one more time, near the end of it, when she could feel it slipping through her fingers. She crossed the floor and yanked the tarp off the chair like she expected to find something hidden under it. Some proof. Some secret. Some justification for everything she'd said. There was nothing under it but wood. Old wood, cracked and given out, that somebody patient had been quietly putting back together, one honest joint at a time. "I'm not going to argue with you, Lauren," I said. "I'm just going to let the dates speak." The chair was finished on a bright, still morning at the end of that summer. I did the last of it with Ellen there. The final coat had cured, and I wiped it down and stood it up on its rockers, and for the first time in nearly 3 years it was whole. The crack closed. The arm new but matched so close you'd have to know exactly where to look, the whole thing standing there like it had never been broken at all. I gave it a push. It rocked, slow and even and silent. No catch, no complaint. Just that soft, endless motion a good rocking chair makes, the sound of a thing finally doing what it was built to do. We both stood looking at it for a while, and I think we both knew that the reason for all those Thursdays was standing finished on the floor between us, and that the not saying couldn't stretch any further because there was nothing left to not say it around. "It's done," I said. It came out heavier than 2 words should. "I know," she said. And then, because one of us had to be braver than I was managing to be, she was. "I need to tell you something, Sam, and I need you to let me get through it." She kept her eyes on the chair, not on me. "I have felt something for you for a long time, longer than I should ever admit to, and I want you to hear the next part more than I've wanted you to hear anything in my life." She stopped. Her hand found the arm of the chair and held it, holding herself steady the way you hold a rail. "I never once let myself want it while you were hers, not for a single day. Whatever I felt, I buried it, and I buried it deep. Because you belonged to my daughter, and that was a line I would have gone to my grave before I crossed. You have to believe that. If you never believe another word I say, believe that one." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Not because she asked me to, but because I'd counted the days myself, alone, near morning, more than once. The calendar believed her too. It had never put us in the same room in that whole empty year. Whatever this was, it had waited, the way she had waited, until there was nothing left in the world to betray. "My part came after," I said, when I could find the words. "I want you to know that too. It didn't so much as flicker until everyone was free and gone. It came clean, or it didn't come at all. That was the only way I could ever have lived with it, and it's the only way I can live with it now." She looked at me then, finally, lifting her eyes from the chair to my face, and something in her let go of a weight it had been carrying for years. I watched her set it down. I watched her shoulders come loose. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The chair sat between us on its new rockers, finished, patient, the way it had waited 3 years to be exactly this. Somewhere, out on the street, a truck went by and faded, and the shop went quiet again. And it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't ask you to fill it. We didn't fall into each other's arms. It wasn't that kind of moment, and we weren't that kind of people. But she left her hand on the arm of the chair, and this time, when I reached over and set mine beside it, she didn't pull away. First time. After all those weeks of 2 people yanking their hands back like they'd touched a hot stove, she just let her fingers stay next to mine on the wood we'd healed together, and we stood there in the open shop, with the door thrown up and the morning light pouring across the floor, and the smell of wax and cut oak in the air, and I have never in my life felt so quietly, so completely, sure of anything. I knew what it would cost. I'd have been a fool not to. In a town this size, a thing like us doesn't stay a private matter for long. There'd be the looks and the talk and the people who'd already decided, thanks to Lauren, exactly what kind of man I was and exactly what kind of fool she was. We could have kept it behind the shop's closed door. It would have been easier. It's always easier to run, to keep a good thing small and hidden where nobody can throw stones at it. We decided not to. "I'm too old to hide, Sam," she said, and there was something almost like humor in it, the first lightness I'd seen in her all morning. "And I've hidden enough for one lifetime. I'm not going to spend what's left of it apologizing for the best thing that ever happened to me." I remember thinking that I had spent my whole life making rough things smooth for other people, and that this was the first time in years anyone had done the same for me, just by refusing to be ashamed of me in front of a whole town. So we stopped hiding. We were seen at the market together, and at the diner on the corner, and on the porch of her house in the evenings with the chair I'd finished sitting just inside the window. We didn't announce it, and we didn't apologize for it. We just stopped pretending, and let the town make of it whatever the town was going to make. In a place like this, that takes more nerve than running, but I'd spent long enough being a careful man who never said the true thing out loud. I was done being careful about the truest thing I'd ever found. What came after was the quietest happiness I've ever known, and I've come to believe the quiet was the whole point of it. We didn't rush anything. We'd both had Loud, and Loud had cost us more than either of us cared to add up, so we went slow. She'd come by the shop in the afternoons the way she always had, except now there was no pretending it was about a chair. I'd cook badly at her place and she'd cook well at hers, and we'd sit on the porch in the long Carolina evenings while the light went down over the live oaks and the cicadas started up in the heat, and we didn't talk about the town and we didn't talk about Lauren. We talked about ordinary things, small things, the kind of things people talk about when they've finally landed somewhere they mean to stay. I thought that was the whole gift. A calm life with a good woman, earned late and against the odds, after both of us had been so sure our chances were spent. I would have called that more than enough. I would have called that a miracle and left it there. Then, in the fall, she stood in the middle of her living room and held up a little white stick and told me she was having a baby. I've already told you about the clock, how it kept going and I didn't. What I didn't tell you was what she said next, once I'd found my way back into my own body and remembered how to breathe. The doctor said it was almost impossible at my age, she told me, and she was steady, steadier by far than I was. Almost. She let that one word sit there in the light between us. I made my peace with almost a long, long time ago, Sam. I put that hope away in a drawer and I closed it. I never once thought the other half of that word was coming for me. Not now. Not ever. Neither had I. It was the kind of thing that doesn't happen, until it does, to somebody, and this time the somebody was us. A 1 in 1,000 morning that walked right through the front door of a life we'd both quietly assumed was finished handing out surprises. I crossed the room and put my hand flat against the small of her back, and I don't think either of us said much for a long while after that. Some news is simply too big for words. You just stand inside it and let it be true. For days afterward I kept catching myself grinning at the wood like a fool, at nothing, in the middle of a cut, and I'd have to set the tool down and stand there and let it wash over me all over again. Lauren heard, of course. She always heard. And she took one more swing, the hardest one she had left. If she couldn't shame us apart, she'd try to make a scandal loud enough to bury us both under it. A baby, at her mother's age, with the man she'd spent a whole summer casting as a schemer and a thief. She talked about lawyers again. She talked about the estate again. She said things about her mother, out loud, in public, that a daughter should never say about anyone, let alone the woman who raised her and fed her and sat up with her when she was small and sick. But the thing about a lie is that it needs the room to stay dark, and this one had long since run out of dark. The dates were still the dates. The empty year was still empty. Faye was still Faye, and she'd told the truth to enough people by then that the truth had finally gotten its boots on and started walking. And a town, even a hard one, even a proud one, can only be asked to believe an ugly thing about decent people for so long before it starts to notice who keeps carrying the ugliness through the door. One by one, the people who'd looked away from me on the sidewalk started looking at Lauren instead, at a grown woman trying to drag her pregnant mother through a courtroom over money, telling any stranger who'd stand still long enough a story that never once matched the calendar. In the end, it wasn't us the town turned away from. It was her. She'd come home to make our lives small, and instead she'd made herself the smallest thing in every room she walked into, and eventually she stopped coming around at all because there was no audience left anywhere for the part she wanted so badly to play. The winter passed slow and easy. Ellen grew round and unhurried and, if anything, more lovely in a way I don't have the words for and wouldn't spend them if I did. And I did the only thing I know how to do when I'm frightened and hopeful at the very same time. I went out to the shop, at night, and I built. There was a night near the end, when it was close, when her time was nearly on us. I couldn't sleep, so I went out and I picked up the plane, and I ran it down the last spindle of a cradle I'd been making by hand. The same oak, the same joints, the same slow and patient work as the chair, and I planed that last piece smooth in the dark, not because it needed it, but because my hands were shaking, and the work is the only thing I've ever found that steadies them. I sanded the rails until they were soft enough that nothing so new and so small could ever catch a splinter on them, and then, because I still couldn't sleep, I sanded them some more. The baby came in the spring. I'll leave most of that night where it belongs, between the two of us. But I'll tell you the picture I carry, the one I know I'll carry until I'm gone. It's early morning, just after, the light coming up gray and then gold through the window, the white hydrangeas blooming again in the yard outside like they'd been waiting on us too. And there is Ellen, in the old rocking chair, her mother's chair, the broken thing I'd covered with a tarp and couldn't finish and couldn't throw away, rocking our child, slow and even and silent. No catch, no complaint. The chair that started all of it, that had sat waiting 3 years in the corner of my shop for a family that wasn't supposed to exist, easing back and forth in the quiet with the smell of warm milk and cut oak in the air. The thing that had been broken was holding up something brand new. I fix broken things for a living. I've said that a few times now, and I've come to think it's the truest sentence I know about myself, only I had the object of it wrong for most of my life. I used to think the broken things were the chairs and the tables, the dressers and the cradles, the wood that comes to me cracked and leaves whole. I don't think that anymore. Looking back from here, with the morning light on the floor and a child asleep down the hall, I understand that the two things most broken when all of this began were a lonely widow everyone had stopped seeing, and a quiet man who'd been thrown away by a family and had half decided he deserved it. Two people the whole town had already written off as finished. And somehow, one honest joint at a time, the two of us got put back together truer than we'd ever been before. Stronger, even, along the mended seam, the way a good repair always is. She told everyone she came back for a rocking chair. We both knew she came back for me. Nobody was rescued here, whatever the town wanted to believe. We just stopped pretending we were beyond saving. So, let me leave you with this. Wherever you're listening from tonight, if love finally showed up at your door wearing the very last face you ever expected, would you have the courage to open it? And when the world decided to make something ugly out of something clean, would you let a calendar and the plain truth speak for you, or would you spend the rest of your life explaining a love that was never wrong to begin with? If this story moved you, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments. Would you have opened the door? I read every single one.